I stood frozen in the doorway of my sister Helen's opulent living room, my heart pounding as I took in the scene before me. Helen, her face twisted with disdain, gripped her daughter Emily's arm tightly. The little girl's eyes were wide with confusion and fear. "You're taking her. I can't have a sick daughter ruining my remarriage. Do you understand, Abby?" Helen hissed, shoving Emily towards me. I instinctively reached out to steady my niece, feeling her small frame trembling beneath my hands. "Helen, what are you talking about? You can't just—" "I can, and I am," Helen snapped, cutting me off. She strode across the room, her high heels clicking against the marble floor. "Joshua's coming to pick me up in an hour, and Emily needs to be gone before then." I gaped at my sister, struggling to process her words. "Joshua, your fiancé? Does he even know about Emily?" Helen's laugh was brittle. "Of course not. And he's not going to find out. That's where you come in, dear sister." Anger flared within me, hot and fierce. "You expect me to just take Emily and pretend she doesn't exist? She's your daughter, Helen. And now she's your problem," Helen retorted, turning away to examine her reflection in a gilded mirror. "I've already packed her things. They're by the door." I looked down at Emily, who hadn't uttered a word since I arrived. Her small face was pale, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I knelt down beside her, my voice gentle. "Emily, sweetie, are you okay?" Before she could respond, Helen's sharp voice cut through the air. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Abby, don't coddle her. She'll be fine with you and Richard. You've always wanted kids, right? Well, here's your chance." The casual cruelty in Helen's tone made my blood boil. I stood up, squaring my shoulders. "You can't just abandon your child, Helen. This isn't like when we were kids and you dump your responsibilities on me. This is a human being. Your daughter." Helen whirled around, her eyes flashing. "Don't you dare lecture me about parenting, Abby. You have no idea what it's been like dealing with her issues. I deserve a chance at happiness, and Joshua is my ticket out of this mess." I felt Emily press closer to my side, and I wrapped an arm protectively around her shoulders. "And what about Emily's happiness? Have you even considered that?" "She'll be happier with you," Helen said dismissively. "Now, if you don't mind, I need to finish getting ready. Joshua will be here soon." As Helen turned back to the mirror, I made a split-second decision. "Fine, we're leaving. But this isn't over, Helen." I gently guided Emily towards the door, pausing only to grab the small suitcase that held her belongings. As we stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, I heard Helen call out behind us. "Oh, and Abby, don't even think about trying to contact me. As far as I'm concerned, this chapter of my life is closed." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the quiet suburban street. I looked down at Emily, who was clutching my hand tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart," I murmured, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're going to come stay with me and Uncle Richard for a while. Is that all right?" Emily nodded silently, her eyes still wide with shock. As we walked to my car, my mind raced. How was I going to explain this to Richard? How could we possibly care for a child, especially one with health issues we knew nothing about? I helped Emily into the back seat, making sure she was securely buckled in. As I slid behind the wheel, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Richard's name flashed on the screen. Taking a deep breath, I answered. "Hey, honey. Listen, we need to talk. Something's happened and, well, we're about to have a house guest." A long-term one. As I started the car and pulled away from Helen's house, I caught sight of Emily in the rearview mirror. Her small face was turned towards the window, a single tear rolling down her cheek. In that moment, I made a silent vow. No matter what it took, I would protect this child and give her the love and stability she deserved, even if it meant going to war with my own sister. I paced the living room, my eyes darting between Emily, who sat quietly on the couch, and Richard, whose face was a mix of shock and concern. "If you're leaving her with us, we won't just babysit. We'll adopt her and make her part of our family," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. Richard nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at Emily. "Of course, Abby. We're in this together." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A sharp knock at the door made us all jump. I exchanged a worried glance with Richard before going to answer it. My mother, Dolores, stood on the porch, her face tight with anger. "Abigail Tucker, what in God's name is going on? Helen just called me in hysterics." I ushered her inside, my stomach nodding. "Mom, I can explain." But Dolores had already spotted Emily. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "So it's true. You've stolen Helen's daughter." "Stolen," I sputtered. "Helen abandoned her. She dumped Emily on me and ran off with her new fiancé." Dolores shook her head, lips pursed. "That's not what Helen told me. She said you manipulated her, took advantage of her vulnerable state." "Mom, stop!" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You know Helen. You know how she twists things." But I could see the doubt in my mother's eyes. It was the same look she'd given me countless times growing up, always believing Helen's version of events over mine. Richard stepped forward, his calm voice a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "Dolores, why don't we all sit down and talk about this rationally?" As we settled into the living room, Emily curled up closer to me, her small hand gripping mine tightly. The gesture wasn't lost on my mother, whose expression softened slightly. "Emily, sweetheart," Dolores said gently, "do you want to go home to your mommy?" Emily's grip on my hand tightened. She shook her head vigorously, burying her face against my arm. Dolores frowned, clearly torn. "But Helen says—" "Helen says a lot of things, Mom," I cut in, struggling to keep my voice level. "But actions speak louder than words, and Helen's actions show she doesn't want to be a mother." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to say. "We're going to adopt Emily. Give her the stable, loving home she deserves." The silence that followed was deafening. Dolores stared at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Finally, she found her voice. "Abby, you can't be serious. This will destroy your relationship with Helen." I laughed bitterly. "What relationship, Mom? The one where she dumps her responsibilities on me and you both pretend it's okay?" Dolores flinched as if I'd slapped her. "That's not fair, Abby. Your sister has always come first," I finished for her. "But not this time. Not with Emily's well-being at stake." Just then, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, my blood running cold. It was a text from Helen. "You think you've won? Just wait. I'll make you regret this, little sister." I showed the message to Richard, whose jaw tightened. "We need to talk to a lawyer," he said quietly. Dolores stood up abruptly. "I need some time to process this. But Abby, please, think about what you're doing. This could tear our family apart." As she left, I felt a mix of anger and sadness, but looking at Emily, peacefully asleep against Richard's shoulder, I knew we'd made the right choice. "We're doing the right thing," Richard reassured me, as if reading my thoughts. I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long, difficult battle. Helen's threat loomed over us, a storm gathering on the horizon. But as I watched Richard gently stroke Emily's hair, I knew we'd weather whatever came our way. For Emily's sake, we had to. The soft glow of the nightlight cast shadows across Emily's sleeping face as I tucked her in. "You're our daughter now, Emily. We're going to love and protect you," I whispered, seeing hope flicker in her eyes before they fluttered closed. As I quietly left the room, a memory crashed over me like a tidal wave. I was 10 again, cowering in the corner as Helen screamed at our parents, demanding attention, always demanding. I shook my head, trying to dispel the image. No, Emily would never know that kind of pain. Richard was waiting for me in the kitchen, his face grim. "The lawyer called," he said softly. "Helen's contesting the adoption." My heart plummeted. She can't do that. She abandoned Emily. Apparently she's claiming temporary insanity due to stress, says she never meant to give Emily up permanently. I slammed my fist on the counter, then immediately regretted it as pain shot through my hand. "It's all lies. How can she—" The shrill ring of the phone cut me off. Richard answered, his expression darkening as he listened. "It's for you," he said, handing me the receiver. "It's Helen." My sister's voice dripped with false sweetness. "Hello, dear Abby. Having fun playing house with my daughter? What do you want, Helen?" I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. "Oh, I think you know. I want my daughter back, and if you don't bring her to me willingly, I'll make sure everyone knows what a manipulative, child-stealing witch you really are." The line went dead. I stood there, frozen, until Richard gently pried the phone from my hand. "What did she say?" he asked, though his eyes told me he already knew. I recounted Helen's threats, my voice shaking. "She's going to turn everyone against us, Richard. My mother already believes her lies. What if—" A small voice from the doorway made us both jump. "Aunt Abby, are you crying?" Emily stood there, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with concern. I quickly wiped my eyes, forcing a smile. No, sweetie, I'm fine. Did you have a bad dream? She nodded, padding over to us. Without hesitation, Richard scooped her up, holding her close. Want to talk about it? He asked gently. Emily buried her face in his shoulder. I dreamed Mommy came and took me away, she mumbled. I don't want to go back. Please don't make me go back. My heart shattered. I joined the embrace, sandwiching Emily between us. Never, I promised fiercely. You're staying right here with us. As we stood there, a family united, I felt a surge of determination. Helen had tormented me my entire life, always taking, always destroying, but not this time. This time I would fight back. The next morning, I called our family doctor, Dr. Patel. I need Emily's medical records, I explained. All of them, from birth until now. There was a pause on the other end. Abby, you know I can't release those without Helen's permission. Please, I begged. It's important. Emily's health and safety might depend on it. Another long pause. Then, come by the office this afternoon. We'll talk. As I hung up, I caught sight of Emily at the kitchen table, happily munching on toast, her legs swinging freely. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked truly relaxed, truly at home. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen. Tick-tock, little sister? Time's running out. I deleted it without responding, my jaw set. Let her make her threats. I had the truth on my side, and I would use it to protect Emily, no matter the cost. As I joined Emily at the table, she looked up at me with a tentative smile. Can we go to the park today? Of course, sweetheart, I said, ruffling her hair. But first we need to make a quick stop at the doctor's office. Emily's smile faltered, fear creeping into her eyes. I leaned in close, my voice soft but firm. Don't worry. I promise, from now on, doctor visits will only ever be to keep you healthy and strong. No more tests, no more pain, okay? She nodded slowly, trust replacing the fear. As we finished breakfast, I steeled myself for the battle ahead. Helen might think she held all the cards, but she had no idea what I was willing to do to keep Emily safe. The war for Emily's future had begun, and I intended to win. The school bell rang, and I watched with pride as Emily bounded out of the classroom, her backpack bouncing with each step. Her smile was radiant, a far cry from the timid child who had arrived on our doorstep months ago. Aunt Abby, Uncle Richard, she called out, rushing into our arms. I got an A on my science project. Richard beamed, ruffling her hair. That's our girl. We knew you could do it. As we walked to the car, Emily chattered excitedly about her day. My heart swelled with love and pride. This was how it should be, a child feeling safe, loved, and encouraged to thrive. But our bubble of happiness was about to burst. As we approached our car, I froze. Helen was leaning against it, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose, a smirk playing on her lips. Well, isn't this a touching family scene? She drawled. Emily instinctively pressed closer to me, her small hand gripping mine tightly. Richard stepped forward, his voice low and warning. Helen, you shouldn't be here. She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, relax. Can't an aunt visit her niece? Her gaze zeroed in on Emily. Hello, darling. Mommy's missed you so much. Emily's grip on my hand tightened. I could feel her trembling. Anger surged through me, hot and fierce. Helen, leave. Now, I hissed. You're scaring Emily. Helen's smirk widened. Am I? Or are you just afraid she'll remember who her real mother is? She took a step closer, and I instinctively moved Emily behind me. Your real family is right here, Emily, Richard said firmly, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Helen's eyes flashed dangerously. Oh, that's rich. You think you can just play house and erase me? I have news for you, dear sister. My fiancé, Joshua, he's not just wealthy. He's influential, and he's going to help me get my daughter back. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? She leaned in, her voice a venomous whisper. Let's just say some people owe him favors, people who can make your little adoption dream disappear. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. But before I could respond, Emily's small voice piped up. I don't want to go with you. I want to stay with Aunt Abby and Uncle Richard. Helen's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little... That's enough. Richard's voice boomed, startling us all. Helen, leave now, or we're calling the police. For a moment, I thought she might lash out. But then she straightened, smoothing her designer dress. This isn't over, she spat, before stalking away. The drive home was silent, the weight of Helen's threats hanging over us. As soon as we arrived, I called our lawyer, relaying Helen's words with shaking hands. "This is serious, Abby," he said gravely. "If she's got connections, this could get ugly. We need to be prepared for a fight." After I hung up, I found Richard and Emily in the living room. Emily was curled up on Richard's lap, her face buried in his chest. My heart ached at the sight. "Your real family is right here, Emily," Richard was saying softly. "We love you, and we're going to do everything we can to keep you safe." Emily looked up at me as I entered, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. I knelt beside them, taking her small hands in mine. "Listen to me, sweetheart. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, you are our daughter. We will fight for you with everything we have." As I held my family close, I knew we were at a crossroads. Helen's threats weren't empty. She had resources and determination on her side. But so did we. And we had something she didn't: genuine love for Emily. In that moment, I made a decision. We wouldn't just defend. We would fight back. Helen had underestimated us for the last time. Whatever it took, whatever sacrifices we had to make, we would keep our family together. The battle for Emily's future was about to begin in earnest, and I was ready for war. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime a stark contrast to the dread that filled my stomach. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Helen stood there, immaculate as always, with a man I assumed was Joshua by her side. Her smile was saccharine sweet, but her eyes were cold. "Hello, sister dear," she purred. "Aren't you going to invite us in?" I wanted to slam the door in her face, but I knew that would only make things worse. Reluctantly, I stepped aside. As they entered, I caught sight of Emily peeking around the corner. Her eyes widened with fear, and I gave her a reassuring nod. "Emily, sweetheart, why don't you go help Uncle Richard in the garden?" Helen's eyes narrowed. "No, I think Emily should stay. After all, this concerns her." I felt my anger rising. "Stay away from her, Helen. You lost the right to call yourself her mother when you abandoned her," I said, firmly standing my ground. Joshua cleared his throat. "Mrs. Tucker, I understand this is a delicate situation, but surely you can see that Emily belongs with her mother." "Her mother?" I scoffed. "The woman who dumped her on our doorstep because she was an inconvenience?" Helen's face contorted with rage. "How dare you? I was going through a difficult time. You have no idea what it's like." "No, Helen, you have no idea," I interrupted, my voice shaking with emotion. "You have no idea what it's like to love a child so much, you'd sacrifice everything for them. To stay up all night when they're sick, to celebrate every tiny victory, to—" "Enough!" Helen shrieked. She turned to Joshua, her voice suddenly syrupy. "Darling, show her the papers." Joshua pulled out an envelope, his expression uncomfortable. "Mrs. Tucker, we've filed for custody of Emily. Given that Helen is her biological mother, and considering our resources, we're confident the court will rule in our favor." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. "You can't do this," I whispered. Helen's triumphant smile made my blood boil. "Oh, but we can, and we will. Emily is coming home with us, where she belongs." Just then, a small voice spoke up. "No." We all turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her little fists clenched at her sides. "I don't want to go with you. I want to stay here with Aunt Abby and Uncle Richard." Helen's face softened, but there was a dangerous glint in her eye. "Sweetie, don't you miss Mommy? We can be a family again with a new daddy who can give you everything you want." Emily shook her head vehemently. "You're not my mommy anymore. Aunt Abby and Uncle Richard are my parents now. They love me." Helen's mask slipped, revealing the fury beneath. She lunged forward, grabbing Emily's arm. "You ungrateful little brat! After everything I've done for you!" I moved without thinking, shoving Helen away from Emily with all my might. "Don't you dare touch her!" Helen stumbled back, shock written across her face. For a moment, the room was silent, except for Emily's quiet sobs. Then Joshua spoke, his voice tight. "I think we should leave now, Helen." As they headed for the door, Helen turned back, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over, Abby. I'll see you in court." The door slammed behind them, and I sank to my knees, pulling Emily into a tight embrace. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay. We're not going to let them take you away." As I held her, I caught Richard's eye over her head. His face was grim, but determined. We both knew what this meant. The real battle was just beginning. Later that night, after Emily was asleep, Richard and I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and adoption papers. "We can't let them win," I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "We can't lose her, Richard." He reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "We won't. Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, we're going to fight for our daughter." In that moment, I made a decision. We wouldn't just defend ourselves in court. We would go on the offensive. It was time to dig up every skeleton in Helen's closet, to expose every lie, every manipulation. The war for Emily's future had begun, and I was ready to fight with everything I had. The courthouse loomed before us, its imposing facade a stark reminder of what was at stake. I gripped Richard's hand tightly as we ascended the steps, Emily between us. Today was the day we'd been dreading and preparing for months. As we entered the courtroom, I saw Helen and Joshua already seated, looking smug and confident. Helen caught my eye and smirked. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to remain calm. We had a plan. Our lawyer, Sarah, approached us. "Remember," she whispered, "stick to the facts. We've got this." The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Helen's lawyer painted a picture of a loving mother who had made a mistake in a moment of weakness, now desperate to reunite with her daughter. It took every ounce of self-control not to scoff audibly. Then it was our turn. Sarah called our first witness, Dr. Patel, Emily's longtime physician. "Dr. Patel, can you describe Emily's health when she was in Helen's care?" Sarah asked. Dr. Patel's face grew grim. Emily was severely undernourished and showed signs of medical neglect. Her condition has improved dramatically since living with the Tuckers. Helen's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. I saw Helen shift uncomfortably in her seat. Next came Emily's teacher, who testified about her academic progress and emotional growth. "Emily has blossomed in the Tuckers' care," she said. "She's confident, happy, and thriving." As the testimony continued, I felt a glimmer of hope. But then Helen's lawyer called his star witness, my mother, Dolores. My heart sank as she took the stand, avoiding my gaze. Helen's lawyer began his questioning, clearly expecting her to support Helen's case. "Mrs. Johnson, in your opinion, who is better suited to raise Emily?" There was a long pause. I held my breath, bracing for the worst. But then my mother straightened her shoulders and looked directly at me. "My daughter Abby," she said firmly. "I was blind for too long to Helen's manipulations. But I've seen how Abby and Richard have loved and cared for Emily. They are her true parents." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Helen's face contorted with rage. I felt tears prick my eyes as my mother finally chose to stand by me. But Helen wasn't done. As the judge called a recess, she cornered me in the hallway, her eyes wild. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "I still have one card left to play. Tell them you're withdrawing your petition, or I'll reveal every dirty secret about our family, including that little incident from your teenage years. You remember, don't you? It would be such a shame if Emily found out her perfect Aunt Abby was once." "Enough." I cut her off, my voice ringing through the hallway. Several heads turned our way. "You will never hurt Emily again. We're done being your puppets," I declared, feeling a sense of liberation wash over me. Helen's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed dangerously. "You'll regret this," she spat before storming off. As we re-entered the courtroom, my hands shook. What if Helen followed through on her threat? What if it swayed the judge? What if... Richard squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "we face it together." The judge cleared his throat. "Having reviewed all the evidence and testimony, I'm ready to make my ruling." Time seemed to stand still. Emily pressed close to my side, her small hand in mine. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. "In the matter of custody for Emily Walker," the judge began, "I find in favor of—" Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. Joshua strode in, his face a mask of fury. "Your Honor," he called out, "I have new evidence that changes everything." The judge frowned. "Mr. Walker, this is highly irregular." But Joshua was already approaching the bench, a thick folder in his hands. "You need to see this before you make your decision," he insisted. As the judge began reviewing the documents, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. What could Joshua have discovered? Had Helen's final threat come to pass? I looked at Emily's frightened face, then at Richard's determined one. Whatever was in that folder, whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I would never stop fighting for our family. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the judge pored over the documents Joshua had presented. My heart raced and I clutched Emily's hand tightly. Richard's arm around my shoulders was the only thing keeping me from crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Walker, these allegations are serious. If true, they could significantly impact this case." Helen's triumphant smirk made my blood run cold. What could possibly be in those papers? The judge turned to our lawyer. "Counsel, are you aware of the contents of these documents?" Sarah shook her head, looking as bewildered as I felt. "No, Your Honor. We request time to review and respond to this new evidence." "Granted," the judge nodded. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." As we left the courtroom, Helen sidled up to me, her voice a venomous whisper. "I told you I'd make you regret this, Abby. By tomorrow, everyone will know the truth about you and your perfect little family." Before I could respond, Richard pulled me away. "Don't engage," he murmured. "We need to focus on what's in those papers." Back at our lawyer's office, Sarah spread the documents across her desk. As I read through them, my heart sank. There were old medical records, police reports, and even school incident reports, all painting a picture of a troubled, unstable teenager. Me. "Helen's dug up every mistake I ever made," I whispered, horrified. "My rebellious phase, the time I got caught shoplifting, even my brief stint in therapy after Dad died. She's twisting it all to make me look unfit to raise Emily." Richard's face was grim. "But that was years ago. You were a kid dealing with trauma. Surely the judge will see that?" Sarah sighed. "It's not that simple. Helen's lawyer will argue that these incidents show a pattern of instability. We need to counter this narrative, and fast." As we strategized late into the night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My blood ran cold as I read it. "I know what really happened the night your father died. Withdraw your petition, or I'll tell everyone." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. That night had been a blur of grief and confusion. I'd always blamed myself for not being there when Dad had his heart attack, but how could anyone else know about that? "Abby?" Richard's concerned voice broke through my panic. "What is it?" I showed him the text, watching his face darken. "This is blackmail," he growled. "We need to tell Sarah." But as our lawyer read the message, a new fear gripped me. What if fighting this only made things worse? What if dragging all this up hurt Emily? "Maybe," I whispered, hating myself for even thinking it. "Maybe we should withdraw, for Emily's sake." Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. "Abby, no, we can't let Helen win like this. Emily belongs with us." "But at what cost?" I cried, tears streaming down my face. "I can't bear the thought of her learning all this, of her looking at me differently." Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Abby, listen to me. You've done nothing wrong. These are desperate tactics from someone who knows they're losing. We can fight this." As I wrestled with my doubts, my phone chimed again. This time, it was a video message from Emily, recorded by my mother. Her sweet voice filled the room. "Aunt Abby, Uncle Richard, I love you. Please don't let them take me away." In that moment, something inside me hardened. I thought of all we'd been through, of the family we'd built. Helen had taken so much from me over the years, but she wouldn't take this. I looked up at Richard and Sarah, my resolve strengthening. "Okay," I said, wiping away my tears. "What's our next move?" As we huddled together, planning our counterattack, I knew tomorrow would be the fight of our lives. But looking at Emily's smiling face on my phone, I was ready for battle. This is our family now, I thought fiercely. We build our future together, no matter what. 12 years had passed since that fateful day in the courtroom. As I watched Emily, now a poised young woman of 18, adjust her graduation cap, I marveled at how far we'd come. "Mom, Dad, hurry up," she called, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "We're going to be late for the ceremony." Richard appeared beside me, grinning proudly. "Our little girl off to college. Can you believe it?" I shook my head, overwhelmed by a rush of memories. The bitter custody battle, Helen's desperate attempts to discredit us, the agonizing wait for the judge's final decision. In the end, the truth had prevailed. Helen's manipulations had backfired spectacularly, exposing her own neglect and deceit. The judge had not only granted us full custody, but had also praised our dedication to Emily's well-being. As we drove to the high school, I couldn't help but think of Helen. Last we'd heard, she was living alone in a small apartment, her dreams of a luxurious life with Joshua shattered. Part of me felt a twinge of pity, but it was overshadowed by the joy of the life we'd built. The graduation ceremony was a blur of emotions. As Emily's name was called, we cheered loudly, our hearts bursting with pride. Mayor Robert Evans, who had become a mentor to Emily over the years, presented her with a special community service award. I caught sight of my mother, Dolores, wiping away tears in the audience. After the ceremony, as we gathered for photos, Emily suddenly grew quiet. "Mom, Dad," she said softly, "there's someone I invited today. I hope that's okay." I followed her gaze and felt my breath catch. Helen stood at the edge of the crowd, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered. For a moment I was transported back to all the pain and anger of the past. But then I saw the uncertainty in Helen's eyes, the way she hesitated to approach. Emily squeezed my hand. "She reached out a few months ago. We've been talking. I think she's changed." I looked at Richard, seeing my own mix of emotions reflected in his eyes. Then I nodded, making a decision. "Go on," I told Emily. "Invite her over." As Helen cautiously joined our group, the years of resentment and hurt seemed to melt away. She looked at Emily with a mixture of pride and regret. "Congratulations," she said softly. "You've grown into an amazing young woman." Emily smiled, then did something that surprised us all. She hugged Helen. "Thank you for coming," she said, "and thank you for giving me the chance to have the best parents I could have asked for." Helen's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Richard and me. "Abby, Richard, I'm so sorry for everything. You gave Emily the life I couldn't. Thank you for loving her when I didn't know how." In that moment, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lift from my shoulders. "We're family," I said simply. "All of us." As we posed for a photo, Emily in the center, flanked by Richard and me, with Helen and my mother on either side, I marveled at the journey that had brought us here. The struggles, the tears, the triumphs, all of it had led to this moment of healing and hope. Later that night, as we sat around the dinner table sharing memories and laughter, Emily raised her glass. "We're ready for anything now," she said, her voice filled with newfound confidence. "Together, nothing can break us." I looked around at the faces of my family, Richard, my rock, Emily, our precious daughter, my mother, finally free from Helen's manipulations, and even Helen, tentatively finding her place in our lives again. I thought of all we'd overcome, of the love that had carried us through the darkest times. "To family," I said, raising my own glass, "to new beginnings and unbreakable bonds." As our glasses clinked together, I knew that whatever challenges the future held, we would face them as we always had, together, stronger for the trials we'd endured, and filled with love for the family we'd fought so hard to build.